All right, guys, welcome back to another episode of Speed Lab Podcast. I am not Les Spellman. My name is Darren Hansen, and I am your substitute podcast host today. My background is I've been coaching athletes for about 14 years. I've owned a facility by the name of HansenAthletics here in Idaho for 10 years, and I've been able to work with athletes of all varying ages and development. Today, we are highlighting RP, Ryan Paul. He is on the podcast today. We're going to talk about all things force production and kind of the unique way that RP looks at it. I'm going to give him a second to introduce himself and talk you guys through who he is and his background.
Thanks, man. Happy to be here. Been training athletes since 2001. I started my company called New Athlete out of the back of my truck. And it's been kind of a journey on just grabbing different modalities or methodics and trying to figure out what works best. And the majority of what our stuff is rooted in the methodics of Jay Schroeder, or what you would see kind of in the Freak of Training video that's been splashed around on social media lately. It's funny how that goes through different waves and everyone thinks it's brand new and they freak out. But anyways, I think this year we will have eclipsed 12,000 athletes, now that I'm realizing what year we're actually in. So I've seen quite a bit, worked with a lot of professional athletes down to middle school and even preteen, pre-adolescent. There we are.
And that is a wild story in terms of, you hear people listen to this or maybe thinking about starting a performance business, or they're in the first stages, and you've been able to make it from the back of a truck to, upwards of 12,000 athletes, which is probably more than most coaches ever get to touch in a lifetime. So I'm super excited to kind of go through, because actually, for the listeners, I went and visited RP's gym just to get an idea of like what the heck was going on up there. Because if you follow him on social media, it's a lot different than what you might traditionally believe to be, strength and conditioning or what you did when you were younger. And it kind of opened my eyes to a lot of things. So to kick it off, I kind of want RP, maybe just share a little bit or talk through like how you look at force production and reduction and how that influences what you do with your athletes.
Sure. So I guess what kind of drove me to where I'm at today is I got tipped on to conjugate periodization and some of the West Side programs that go along with that, and went full tilt with that. My guys saw great results. But it was almost like the dam kind of broke out of it. And to the defense of conjugate, I think there were a lot of holes that I wasn't filling, which led to a lot of injuries. But if I'm looking at just what I was observing through only using conjugate, it was really great for getting my numbers to go up and quote unquote producing more force or moving more weight. But where I felt like it really lacked was it doesn't carry over to the game and the aspects of the game. More specifically speaking of, an athlete rarely, if ever, gets hurt when they're accelerating. It's usually when they're in contact with someone or decelerating. And I would even put contact as a deceleration. Okay. So if they can't handle whatever forces are coming at them, then to me, there's a deficit.
Absolutely. And then from my own research, it looks like the arguments are rising too of like, you're only going to be able to produce as much force or some sort of ratio of force comparable to how much force you can handle, right? Or reduce. Maybe the body has like some inhibitions within it. What is your thoughts on that?
I guess, can you define inhibitions more? I agree with you, but I'm just trying to get a little more specific just to hone in.
Yeah, I think where I'm at is kind of the body's awareness of, I can only handle so much force without, risking injury, or I'm not comfortable at a certain load neuromuscularly. Like I don't have that connection between the brain and the body. So potentially it limits how much force you can produce to keep it safe from, reduction or deceleration forces that are beyond what it feels comfortable with handling because they haven't touched that in training. They're just hitting that in sport.
Sure. Okay. So I'll just give you an example because I know before we jump down, you threw out the question of what am I seeing versus the young kids versus my pro athletes or combine guys. And with almost 100% certainty, all of the guys that come in from the collegiate setting, number one, they're wrecked. Number two, they can move a ton of weight, but they really, really lack, and this is shown in using Hawken and some other things, their braking RFD is terrible. Unless they have had some coach really hone in on teaching them how to break down with routes or break down from full sprints or, however it is, unless they've been given that type of quality or they've been taught that quality, their data comes back as very, very deficient or poor.
Okay.
So that's kind of the first, for me, that's the first thing that I look at is if I've got a linebacker that's in let's assume he's playing at a high level, D1 or above, and he's 230 and I see him jump and he lands and he's producing 7,400 Newtons on his braking. To me, that's extremely deficient. Now, if I could cue him and tell him to stick his landing, he's automatically going to go up. But to me, if you remove the cueing that I would give him to stick that landing, it kind of lends itself to there being a neurological deficiency in how he's responding to the ground or responding to the force that he's having to produce to stop himself.
Okay. That makes total sense. So what's interesting is, I don't have access to as much of this data collection as, for example, your facility. But one thing I do recognize with a lot of my athletes that I train all through high school, they leave, they go to a college, they come back. They're a lot of times they're slower, they're stronger, like you said, but they've kind of lost that like magic that like the coach's eye can see of the way they move, the way they skip, the way they sprint. So I'm wondering now, I wonder if it's a combination of like they're maturing, so they're gaining weight naturally. A lot of colleges are getting kids, putting on muscle mass, putting on weight, putting on strength, but potentially they're missing this lack of stimulus that you're talking about here. So actually you see like performance numbers drop or just injury risk rise. Like, what's your thoughts? Do you agree with that or what's your thoughts on that?
I do agree with that. And I would go even further into that I think when you have a lot of, let's just take your collegiate athletes, just because you threw that out. I think the focus becomes more on concentric, heavier lifting. And I think when the body has repeated bouts of concentric heavy lifting, it naturally is going to tighten up. And when it tightens up, it loses its ability to decelerate forces eccentrically. And when you lose your ability to decelerate forces eccentrically, that force has to go somewhere, ligaments, tendons, bones. Or at the same time, I think when you have a ton of heavy concentric lifting, you actually create a low-grade inflammation systemically, and you increase the ability for injuries to come in or susceptibility.
Okay, I like that. So within your program, my first question, let's say if I was first hearing this as a coach is, okay, maybe I've been making this mistake. Maybe I've been doing a lot of concentric work only. I mean, what percentages or like a training session, I mean, are you touching these capabilities we're talking about eccentrically? Let's say like outside of sprinting, let's say like in the weight room, because most people listening to this know, consistent speed work is important, jumping, plyometrics, because, or at least in the way that we think about them, because athletes need consistent exposure to those to maintain those qualities. But when it comes to like the weight room, if an athlete comes in on your programming, are they spending like 50%, doing depth drops and then lifting, or are they spending more time doing eccentric qualities versus concentric? Or can you give us some insight into that?
Yeah. So for me specifically, in our system, I would say it's an 80-20 ratio. But I can't say that as like, that's a blanket, like everybody's getting that, because it depends. If an athlete comes in and their movement patterns are extremely compromised, I've got to spend more time on getting what I would say good foundational movements to become second nature for them. Then I'm going to go more towards depth drops. But I mean, what that's going to mean is we're going to start off with a 6-inch box. Maybe we do 200 reps, then we go to a 12-inch, then we go to an 18, and then a 24. But I would say overall, if I was to give a ratio, I would say it ranges between 60 to 80% is going to be in that eccentric realm, followed by a lot of long duration max joint angle isometrics.
Yeah. That's perfect. Let's bleed into that. Like, what benefits are you seeing with your athletes, and talk about those durations, because a lot of people think like, 20 seconds is a long time. So let's talk a little bit about that. Okay.
So the durations for us will go anywhere from 5 seconds to 300 seconds. It depends on where we're at. So what I would say is, if an athlete comes into us and on our readiness scale, they're saying I'm at a 5 out of 10, they're automatically going to mobility and then long duration isos, which would be 2 minutes, 30 seconds and above.
Okay.
And the reason that I like that, and this kind of gets into the weeds with Schroeder's stuff, is that it's been preached for years that I've known and followed Jay's stuff, that 5 minutes was the magic window. And if we can get an athlete to do that, that does not mean that they're going to actually hold a particular position for 5 minutes maximally. It's not going to happen. And I can confidently say that I've had one athlete that, and I'm talking 25 years, one athlete that has held an isometric lunge without fail for 5 minutes, working maximally. One.
Yeah.
So the idea is that if I'm in that position, I'm going to work maximally until I fail. The clock is continuing to run. When I fail, I've got 2 deep breaths. I immediately get back in, reassume the position that I want, and I continue to rinse, wash, repeat that until the time is eclipsed.
Okay.
So what's happening is I'm cycling through the energy systems and almost forcing a faster recovery rate by having the athlete jump back into that position. I'm not going to rest for 2 minutes. I don't care about full recovery. Additionally to those max joint angle isometrics, you have a huge stimulation to mitochondria. There's a bunch of other things that come out of that, but I think what happens is because you're having such a big stim to the mitochondria and you're cycling through those energy systems, I repeatedly hear from athletes when they come from our program to their collegiate programs, like, there's new athlete shape and then there's in shape, and they're 2 totally different things. And I've got a running back that's up at UW, big boy, he's 6'2", 230. He reported early, and after the high school season, we only had about 5 to 6 weeks to really kind of prep him and get him ready. And when he left and he got up there, he was these are his words to me: I couldn't believe how good a shape I was in. But we didn't do the stuff that they were doing or focusing on at his school. We were just doing the same stuff that we were doing at New Athlete, and just cycling it 2 to 3 times a week, mix it in maybe with some 5 to as high as 20% heavy concentric lifting, but it was selective on what we were doing with those lifts. And I really was not concerned about what, kind of weight they were moving. I'm more concerned about stim. And that's another segment that we can talk about, is I view everything from a stimulation standpoint, not a weight standpoint, which I guess kind of lends itself more into making sense when we're talking about force.
All right, we got to take a second to talk about the universal speed rating, because I literally just found this out and it blew my mind. We just hit over 500,000 verified speed tests inside the USR software. 500,000. That's coaches all over the country testing, tracking, and proving athlete progress with the system. It's not just data. It's giving athletes confidence and giving coaches real proof of results. I remember running our first Speed Lab test back in 2019 in a closet that my uncle helped me build, now 500,000. If you're not testing speed yet, or you're doing it without a system, this is your chance to check it out. Hit the link in the description, book a free consult, and see how the USR could work in your program.
I actually have a couple questions just to clear some things up for people. So you talked about it. Obviously, it's important during these ISOs that they're working maximally the whole time. What are some cues that you're using with them? Like, how are you cueing? Let's say we're doing, like, a lot of coaches are familiar with like a split position yielding ISO. Like, what are some mistakes that athletes normally make? If I'm coaching them and I'm trying to implement the stuff Ryan's telling me about, what's your typical mistake? What kind of cues are you giving them to really make sure they're active in that spot in the way that you want?
Sure. So I think one of the things that I like, and I'll answer your question, but I'll kind of give you a segue of how I use the lunge to also determine what type of sprinting athlete they are. Most of our spinners are going to be very, very short in the lunge, and they're also going to lean over at the hip, almost like they're hinging. So we then throw data on them. We can put them on catapult, get a 5 build 10 fly, 10 build 10 fly, or even just get them on video. And they're 9 times out of 10, they're very pitter pattery. Tons of steps, really don't go anywhere. Where if you get some of our elite 100, 200, maybe 400 guys that come in, they're very long in the lunge, meaning a 90-degree angle with the front leg. The back knee will typically be 135-ish at that angle. And we're using that just to show a little bit of, okay, what is their athleticism? How can they move as it pertains to sprinting and accelerating? And that may be a very ignorant way of looking at it, but it's been a pretty good indicator for us as to what we can expect to see out of that athlete. So back to your original question on executing the lunge, or if we're looking at that one in particular. So let's assume my left leg is forward. I want to begin ramping up tension by pulling in maximally with that left hamstring. At the same time, I'm driving down into the ground with that left glute. Right glute, I'm going to begin to extend while rolling the hip into an anterior tilt, which will allow the GTO of the front right hip flexor to shut off because the opposing muscle is contracting. Then we can actually get the nervous system to understand what it is to be at length. And that just by doing that alone, we begin to see some gait changes, and we start to see changes in max velo.
Okay. So I've got a visual of it. So you guys might have to play that back and listen to that. But yeah, obviously it's really important at the end there that you have the pelvis tucked under in the right position, which, let's say an athlete, they're tight in their hip flex. Let's say they can't really get into that. Do you start them shorter in the lunge and then work over time to that lengthened position?
It depends on the disposition of the athlete. Yes and no. Yeah. If we got some dogs in there, I'm going right to it. There's no leeway for them. They got to go right to it.
Yeah.
If some of the athletes come in and I get a sense that, I'm not going to be able to push them, then I'll kind of let them go to their own degree. Or what we'll do is we'll break it in and we'll go, okay, you got 4 sets of a minute. Your last set, you have to go to max joint angle.
Okay.
Or I've had some where we go, you're going to go 10 seconds short, 10 seconds long, 10 seconds short, 10 seconds long, just to almost prime the nervous system to say, hey, it's okay to be in this lengthened position.
Yeah. Okay. This is all amazing. So I'm taking a ton of notes. Obviously, sounds like to me, it's also a great assessment tool, right? So you can look at your athletes, like you said, you can almost classify, what this athlete struggles with in their sprinting. Is it frequency? Is it length? Are they able to hit long positions, drive through the ground? You know, and
So one of the,
go ahead.
oh, sorry. Don't mean to cut you off, but it's another good thing to keep in mind that prior to meeting Les and getting involved in USR, there was our KPIs were either visual or auditory. So there was data was not even, it wasn't even on the horizon. In fact, I found data to be extremely annoying. I found the tech to be annoying. We had Tendo units, and, you know, using those to just come up with a number for the sake of coming up with something, I found to be irritating, because I could get that number if I just heard the bar move the way that I wanted the bar to move. Yeah. Just like if, you know, you listen to sprinters and you can tell when someone is fast because that metronome is very, very fast or very slow, or those were things that we were using. So the lunge took on more meaning as far as, you know, what is this athlete going to display to us? And then once we got in with USR and we really started to sink our teeth into data, it then confirmed what we were suspecting and what we were seeing before.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off on that.
No, that's a great way to segment into some, like, for listeners to understand the benefits of like USR and working with Les and those guys. So I love that. One question that pops into my head is, like, for a listener, I mean, I came up there and went through this, and like you said, being in shape, right? Like, I thought I was pretty in shape and I almost threw up. So it was a pretty wild experience doing some of these longer durations. What does, you know, if people wanted to implement this with his athletes, does this give them insight into like the recovery between sessions look like when you're doing these maximum high intensity holds? You know, do you see this really shut down athletes for a couple of days? They need time to reset, or, you know, would it be the opposite of what you would initially think and they're pretty fresh throughout the week?
Well, I think to answer that, you kind of have to, I guess, get into the mind of the athlete on what is fresh, what is recovered, what is, you know, some meathead athletes, they chase soreness to validate that they've got a good workout. And that could be good. I think it's more on the ignorant side if that's what we're just chasing. Because to me, the more sore that you are, the more inflammation you've created. And if you're not combating that, eventually it's going to rear its ugly head, and you're going to be you're going to be an inflamed systemic issue. So the recovery time on this, what the athletes will come back to us and say is, I'm sore as hell, but it's weird. It's different. I feel like I can move, and I don't feel like I'm old and rickety, and I don't know how to explain that. And I think what happens with that is that you end up changing how the nervous system is actually moving. And here's one of the examples that I would give with this. So we have a lot of high school football players that come in, and, you know, you look at a big kid, 6'4"-ish, 230, and he goes, yeah, I'm squatting 450. But then you have him do an air squat on camera, and he has no control over that whatsoever. So what that tells me is that he's dependent on the weight to create the range of motion, to check the box of that's a good squat, and then convinces himself that he's a good athlete, he's a strong athlete, because he's actually moving this weight. When in reality, if he doesn't have the control with his body weight, he really is completely out of control with 400 pounds on his back. And he doesn't have an ability to actually decelerate not just his body weight, but forces that are greater than what he's being put on with 400 pounds. So with that being said, I think those types of athletes don't really understand how to move, and their body is in a defensive state in every training session that they go through.
Yeah.
So they're constantly beat up and they're constantly sore, but, you know, they fall in love with the game of, you know, this is just part of the process. I got to grind. And, you know, that's just what it is. But I can't move, or my back hurts, or my knee hurts, or, you know, those are the common things that we hear, where we then take that athlete, we flip them, start them learning how to actually handle the forces that they're going to see on the field, but then do it 50, 100, 150, 200 times in a given session. And because they can actually stop or actually produce more force eccentrically, their concentric lifts go up, but their inflammation comes down because they're actually moving agonist, antagonist, and there's a harmonic dance between those two muscles, or whatever, whatever muscle group you're using. And because of that, that low-grade inflammation is reduced.
Quick pause here. I want to talk about the universal speed rating. So many coaches I meet are just overwhelmed. They're running sessions, programming, dealing with parents, and trying to prove their athletes are actually getting faster. One of the reasons why we built USR was to take some of this stress off the table. One software solution to help coaches test, track, and show improvement without adding hours to your week. If you feel like you're guessing with your speed training or trying to make sense of your data, hit the link in the description. Schedule a free consult and see how the USR can help.
So to sum it up, guys,
I went on a major tangent.
Yeah, it's different, right? Like it's different than when you think about lifting weights and the soreness levels. I mean, I remember feeling fresh the next day, but also fatigued, which sounds like totally different. But I felt really good after going through some of these long duration holds. And I think I actually we sprinted right after it, and I tied my best time ever at the time, or my best miles per hour. So it's definitely a very interesting stimulus. When we've talked a lot about like the long lunge position. What are one or two other of your favorite ways to load this and patterns that you use with athletes consistently?
Oh gosh. I mean, it could be any movement that a human should be doing.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily
segment lower body. Let's be like lower body sprinting. What's a couple other?
Okay. I'm going Bulgarian split, or what we would call back foot elevated, but then I would also go rear foot elevated to where, my back knee is, 155 degrees.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really, really open. Front knee, front shin is always going to be at 90, unless I'm working on a different quality. If I'm working on accelerating as it pertains to sprinting, then I'm going to lean that forward a little bit more. And I want to convince the nervous system that, the angles that I need in a shin in sprinting are appropriate. Because I think what a lot of athletes do, and here I go off on a little tangent, is they like to segment what they see pro athletes doing, and then they try to replicate that without having the context of why that pro guy is doing it. Or they don't have the backstory of, well, that pro guy, he's 25 years old, he's 30 years old, he's 200 and some odd pounds, he's been training for 15 years, he understands how to move.
Yeah.
Where you, as the freshman, sophomore, junior, whatever, you don't have a clue how to move, but now you're trying to go to the end of the result when you don't even know how to crawl as a baby.
Yeah. That makes total sense.
So the other thing, I'll circle back to the movements. I do want to squat, but I want my feet about, what I would do is I would go fist width apart, or I would go right where the hip joint actually is. I want to try to get back to as infinite, and not like infinity, but wrong word, infant, like toddler movements, because I think that's where everything is rooted. Okay. And if a lot of athletes are very awkward with their movement patterns, then I'm going to have a march in place, because I want that stimulation from both cortexes.
Yeah.
So there's I'm kind of jumping all over the place, so I apologize, but that's another thing, that you get an athlete that comes in and they struggle with a lunge, or you see them skip and they're going same side, same knee, same arm forward. To me, that's a cortex issue, which also is then a coordination issue.
Yeah. And that's more common than people think. I think if you don't coach athletes, like when you get a young athlete in, at least in today's where athletes are at, that's pretty common if you get a younger kid that comes in. And you're like, whoa, where do we start there? Right. So you're giving some solutions for that, which I love.
Yeah. And typically what I found, because I'll ask parents, did your child walk before they were 1? And, they kind of light up and they're like, yeah, he was really, really good. And I almost want to go, no, he wasn't good. He just did what you forced him to do when he wasn't ready to do it.
Yeah.
You took him from crawling to, oh my gosh, he's walking at 9 months. He's a prodigy. He's not a prodigy at all. What you did is you interrupted that feed forward system and that cross crawl pattern. And now you're paying me to fix it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm, you know what? When I have my first kid, I'm going to 100% I'm going to make them crawl till they're 5. You know what I'm saying? No, I'm just kidding.
You know how fast they'd be?
So fast. I love that. Okay. Now, so when athletes are coming in your gym, they're touching some form of this type of work every day when they're in with training with you, right? You don't just have one day they come in, they do this, and then they go back to training normal per se, right?
Every day.
Awesome. My wrapping up question, because there's a lot in this, and I'm hoping you guys will reach out to Ryan as well to kind of dive deeper into this. But just from layman's terms, people that haven't seen your gym, haven't seen your Instagram, haven't seen what's going on, that the results you're producing kind of with this mindset and what you're doing have been pretty ridiculous, really. So I want to hear like what initially comes to your mind when it's like, okay, if I start implementing some of this in my training, what are the benefits you're seeing to your athletes that maybe that you're not seeing with other athletes that aren't doing this, as well as like the carryover to their speed development?
Well, again, just my observation, but the first thing that stands out is the athletes become healthier. Number one. Number two, their repeatability on the field goes up tremendously. Their results or max velocity or vertical or, all the numbers that we want to have increase. And then I find that the injury rate drops significantly, or the severity of the injuries reduces dramatically.
Yeah. Which, I mean, those 3 things you just said are, I think, what every coach is chasing. So to recap it, repeatability, which I've made a couple of videos on how, coaches say they want athletes that are in shape. I think in reality, what they're saying is they want athletes that can repeat high efforts, repeatably. Max velocity, so developing top speeds. I think one thing you didn't mention is it's going to work that other end of the spectrum too, with the deceleration capabilities, which bleeds into that game speed for athletes, being able to decel, accelerate, and then healthier, right? Those are all things that those are all the buzzwords that you hear with what coaches want with their athletes. So I think 100% implementing these is important. What would be your advice, as a coach that's hearing this and they're like, dude, RP, I'm bought in. I'm really interested in starting to implement or learn more. How can they go about that? Where should they start if they want to implement something like this next week on Monday after listening to this podcast?
Well, one of the things that is kind of a goggle that I put on, or a lens that I put on, is if I take an athlete, and I'll just take you, my question to you would be, how many steps did you take in a given practice?
Well, we weren't even tracking at the time, but a lot.
Sure, but now expand that out to the week, and then the game, and then a month, and then 2 months, and 3 months, and now 6 months, and then 7. Now you're getting upwards of 17, 20,000 steps. So am I really going to believe that in the weight room, 4 sets of 8 to 10 are going to fill the gap of something that I'm doing 17,000 times? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Now, could you replicate that volume? Not necessarily, but if I think, what is my ground contact time every time that I step on the ground? It's, a fraction of a second. Let's assume that I'm elite, or let's assume that I'm not, but a full second. So if I'm holding in those positions for X amount of time, 300 seconds, and now I expand that out with the same thought process of how many during a week, during a month, during, 6 months, I can begin to, and maybe this is just a flawed way of thinking about it, but I begin to close that gap from that 20,000 to whatever, I was before.
Yeah.
So to answer your question on what could coaches do, kind of break out of that mindset of it has to be 8 reps or it has to be 12 or it has to be, whatever methodics you're using, and press it and just see what the athletes do and see how they respond. I'm not saying go from, well, we've never done this before and now we're going right to 200 reps. It's too big of a stimulus, but you want to do something that's going to start to capture what is actually happening on the field of play in the weight room.
Yeah.
And then using your data in your high speed velocity sprints or your decel or your XL, and then see what the data does and then look at what the trends are on that and then adjust accordingly.
Love it. Awesome. Ryan, thanks for being on the pod. I know there's going to be so many follow-up questions, so we'll make sure to put your tag and your information into the show notes and all of that and take care of that for you. Thanks for your time. Appreciate you hopping on and sharing with everyone.
Yeah, appreciate it, man. Thank you very much.